in this room. Did you guys hear me? She has lost her glasses. So if you find a pair of glasses, they have black rims. You found them? Yes, thank you. Please give them to me, and I'll make sure they get back to her.
Maybe if you start singing, Shay.
Now, you have not heard me sing because you know that that's a threat. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the day. I'm really excited about this one, in part because I'm joined by some really incredible and inspiring people here on stage. I want to start out introducing this session by mentioning something that came out of the Religions for the Earth conference last year, which is that it's too late to stop climate change. The climate is changing, and we've already locked ourselves into a certain degree of warming. We can act to mitigate it, and we can act and we can decide what to do as a global community now, but stopping climate change is no longer on the table. There are a number of solutions being proposed from various leaders of the world, some of which have the interests of the most vulnerable people in mind, and some of which do not. But I'm here on stage with a number of grassroots activists who are doing what I think Naomi Klein called solutions from below. They're part of a network of people who are acting on sometimes very small local issues, but are part of a large network, organizing to bring forth a better world, one where we turn away from the destructive patterns that we have seen so often in our history, and in which we move on into a different way of being with each other and with the earth. So we're going to do this a little dynamically. I hope you guys are all right with that. I know it's been a long day of people talking at you, and I am very grateful for your patience and for your attention span. I don't know if I have one nearly as good as all of you do. But I'm going to introduce the panelists, and they're going to say a few opening remarks, and then we're going to talk amongst each other and also open it up to the audience for most of the session. So first I want to start by introducing Tim DeChristopher. He has embodied the sort of committed and direct action that our present condition urgently needs. Tim is the notorious Bitter 70. In 2008, he disrupted and derailed an auction of Utah public lands to mining and fossil fuel corporations, which was orchestrated by the outgoing Bush administration. Before the auction could be rescheduled, the new Secretary of the Interior examined the land sell-off and found it to be illegitimate. Tim single-handedly preserved thousands of acres of land from fossil fuel and resource extraction. He was also convicted of 2 felonies for this action and spent nearly 2 years in prison. After his release, Tim began attending the Harvard Divinity School, where he has been active in demanding that Harvard divest from fossil fuels. He recently founded the Climate Disobedience Center. Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Shay for jumping in at the last minute and facilitating this panel when Terry Tempest Williams couldn't be here. And thank you to all the other speakers who have shared so many great ideas with us the rest of the day. I'm especially grateful to all the other speakers because as somebody who's in the last panel, I don't really feel the need to be comprehensive at all because so many other great ideas have been shared that I feel liberated to just throw out some half-baked ideas that have been bouncing around in the forefront of my mind. So with the hope of keeping it interesting, I wanted to start with some ideas that I feel like I started to understand yesterday. So most of my work is with people engaging in civil disobedience at the grassroots of the climate movement, and people very much at the bottom of our movement, as Shay was describing. But I've also developed kind of a big national reputation in doing that, and so I also have the opportunity to engage in some of the higher level stuff in the climate movement. And so yesterday I was down in Washington, D.C. with a big collection of national organizations and also frontline activists who were just launching the Keep It in the Ground campaign that is calling for an end of fossil fuel leasing on all federal lands, which would keep about 450 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the ground. So it was the launch of a big campaign. We had a big press conference right outside of the White House, and then we had a meeting with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and then we had a meeting with the Department of the Interior, which was a different kind of experience for me. The last time I was at the Department of the Interior, we were occupying the lobby of the building, and 22 of our folks got arrested doing it. So it was very different to be in this sort of role. And I began to understand kind of the divide that exists both within the climate movement and especially between a lot of the climate movement and a lot of the folks working in government who I think do have some desire to do something about climate change. And that was coming out especially in the meeting that we were having with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, that we were really approaching this from a different paradigm. And it took them a bit to understand what we were asking for of this radical shift of just ending the leasing program and keeping all of those fossil fuels in the ground. And we had to explain to them that we're actually asking for a new paradigm. And then we had to further explain to them that actually most of our climate movement has already had this new paradigm. And during the course of that meeting, I began to understand and get some clarity on what that divide is, that intellectual divide, that paradigm divide that is separating so much of the climate justice movement from the folks operating in our government. And so I said to the folks on the Council of Environmental Quality that our movement at this point, all the people that all those organizations represent in that room, really doesn't care that much about what's considered politically feasible within the Beltway. That is not our benchmark of what is success, of what is reasonable. We really don't care that much if Obama's policies are better than George W. Bush's policies. That's not our benchmark either. Our benchmark is not what's been done. Our benchmark is not the status quo. We're not looking at the status quo trajectory and measuring our success based off how much we deviate from the status quo. The movement that we are representing is looking at the challenge of climate change itself and what are the demands of the climate crisis. And that is really our only benchmark that matters. And the demands of climate justice. So we had a lot of people in that room who were representing folks in the Gulf Coast, indigenous communities from the Diné Reservation, from Alaska, from all over the place. And they were talking about the direct impacts of fossil fuel development and also the climate impacts that they're already seeing. And they weren't asking for just a deviation from the status quo. They were actually asking for actual climate justice. And what I told the Council of Environmental Quality is that I know that seems naive from the perspective of a Washington insider working within our government. It might seem naive to not circumscribe our efforts by what is considered to be politically feasible. But I can almost guarantee them that history is on our side, that it's rather inconceivable that future generations are going to look back on this time and compare Obama's efforts on climate change to what's considered politically feasible at this time. They're going to compare his efforts on climate change to the demands of the climate crisis. And whether or not he rises to that challenge will determine his legacy on this issue. And so that helped me to understand that part of standing in solidarity with the grassroots of the movement and with the frontline communities in our movement is to make our benchmark, the benchmark of justice, the benchmark of climate justice, not work from a benchmark of the status quo. That for those who are not receiving justice, the marginalized communities, the frontline impacted communities, and the young people, which I think we often forget are a core marginalized and impacted community in terms of climate injustice. For those communities, what matters is reaching that point of climate justice, not how much we deviate from the status quo. And so that, to me, is something that should guide our efforts in trying to really be in solidarity with the grassroots of the movement, is making our benchmark what climate justice actually looks like. And that's part of the reason why I think religious communities need to play an increasing role in the climate movement. Because at least in my framework of what religious means, it is those communities that are genuinely guided by values. In my framework, I don't necessarily make the divide between the religious and the secular. For me, the dichotomy is between the religious and the expedient. That those who are guided by their values because they believe in those values versus those that are guided by their values that seem to have a logical, positive outcome for their actions. That the religious communities, I think, are those who have the practice, the spiritual practice of being guided by their sense of vision and their values, not by what they think is feasible. And so that's an important perspective that I think needs to be brought into the climate justice movement. And one of those values that I see that needs to be brought in is valuing truth for its own sake. And I think it might seem odd sometimes to talk about a lack of truth in the climate movement or a deficit of truth, because we often see our opponents as those who completely abandon truth and disregard science and evolution and gravity and everything else. And so it's easy to think of ourselves as the truthful side because we're more truthful than them. But I think we're actually reaching a point where the truths that we know about climate change are really difficult ones to speak. And I've seen this recently just with a couple of emails that I got from climate organizations that I actually respect, that I think are doing good work. And one of them came in and said, this is an extremely important email, and it talked about the releases of methane in the Siberian Ocean this summer that were an order of magnitude greater than we'd seen before. And said this could be the tipping point that scientists have warned us about. And then it said in bold letters, but we can stop this just by switching our energy from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We can stop this. And I know people that work for that organization, and I know that they know that if this is the methane tipping point, that we can't just put that methane back by switching to solar energy. They know that what they're telling people is not really true. Then a couple days later, I got another email from a different organization that has this big visioning project of trying to look at what climate justice looks like by 2050. And their whole framework for this is, it's 2050, we've stabilized the climate. 2050, and we've got a stable climate. And I know people who work for that organization, and they all know that there's about a 40-year time lag between carbon emissions and their impacts on the climate, which means that a stabilized climate in 2050 would have required us to almost shut off carbon emissions in 2010, which we didn't do. So again, they know that what they're telling people is not really the truth that they actually believe, but I think there's a conventional wisdom that people can't actually handle the truth, that the real truth that we know about the severity of climate change will scare people into paralysis, will push people into despair, and that people can't handle the truth, that people just want simple things, they want to be told what to do, and that people can't handle the truth. And I was reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed recently, and it was talking about the need to really trust the people that you're working with. And I think part of solidarity with anyone we're working with really has to be trusting them to handle the truth of the situation, whether that truth is certain realities about climate change or whether that is a personal truth of being willing to share the fact that we might be depressed right now or we might be feeling despair at the moment, but sharing those truths as well. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that you can't be in solidarity with someone that you don't trust to handle the truth. That a core requirement of standing in solidarity with the grassroots of our movement is trusting that grassroots to handle the full truth and to be able to move through it. And I think those are just two things that I want to throw out, and I know we'll have lots of time to discuss, so I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Tim. Our next panelist is Catherine Flowers, the Senior Fellow at the Center for Growth Ethics and the founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise. In addition to her work with the Equal Justice Initiative, Catherine serves the citizens of Lowndes County, one of the poorest counties in the country, where she was born and raised, advocating for better sewage and waste infrastructure and against coal ash pollution and other forms of industrial waste.
Thank you very much. Well, I have had to grapple with a number of questions to prepare for this. Can you hear me? Okay. I've had to grapple with a number of questions in terms of responding to what we've been asked to do at this particular session. And one of the questions was the biggest lessons from my grassroots level experience is, one of the biggest lessons was is understanding the intersection of science, history, and climate justice. As I do my work in Lowndes County, Alabama, and when I talked about the wastewater problem, people living amongst raw sewage, people didn't get it until we connected it to the science. Once they realized that it could have an impact on them, and not just the people that were living in that situation, I think that that's when we were able to get some traction. In doing my research as a grassroots organizer, I've learned that we have to go back and read history. I think sometimes people feel that to dispel the past and try to deal with the present is the best way to go. But sometimes we have to go back, and I think that's where elders come in, and that's why that wisdom is important. In doing so, it was recommended that I read a book called The Germ of Laziness. Why was that important? Well, that particular book talked about the hookworm infestation and the rise of the Rockefeller Foundation. What most people don't know is that the Rockefeller Foundation was the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. And the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission gave rise to public health in the South. But actually, it was in the Rockefellers at that time, I won't compare them to these famous brothers that we talked about earlier, but the Rockefellers were, at that time, were trying to find a way that their workers that were living in these tropical areas would be able to be more productive. And in doing so, a doctor came up with a theory that they were not as productive because of hookworm infestation. And they found that ground zero for hookworm infestation was Alabama. And Alabama is where I do a lot of my work, and we're finding out that hookworm infestation is a real possibility again because of raw sewage being on the ground. And I'm not going to jump the gun and release the study, but the study is going to be released the week of October 25th, where we're going to talk about the tropical illnesses that we discovered. But I said all this to say that they announced at some point that hookworm had been wiped out. And the Hookworm Sanitation Commission became the Rockefeller Foundation. The interesting thing is that we don't look at history, and we're not looking at what's going on now in a lot of cases. And it's very hard to find foundations that would even fund wastewater infrastructure in the United States because the overarching belief is that we don't have this problem in this country. But I think it's a glaring example of inequality and why we need a paradigm shift in terms of sustainable economic development goals in the richest country in the world that people are living amongst raw sewage. Because obviously the current paradigm that we have reinforces poverty. And one of the, I think, milestones or hallmarks to determine whether or not we have advanced is how we treat the waste that comes from humans. And that's one of the most powerful lessons I've learned in this whole struggle. Everything that I've done growing up in the midst of the civil rights movement is finding that we have to recognize that the progress that we've made in this country has not reached the least of these. And until we eliminate poverty and these poverty-stricken conditions and diseases related to poverty from the United States, I think we cannot say The next, it leads to my second point is how I would frame this in terms of morality, spirituality, in terms of the beliefs, my whole belief system, and how we use spirituality, how spirituality has been used in this country, especially in the South, to get people to vote against their interests. I think that we have to understand that the other side is very, very adept at taking that and framing a narrative to represent them. Actually, I'm seeing it from my point of view, my vantage point, the truth that I'm seeing, even with this current presidential election and the rhetoric that's out there, is very, very scary to me. It's very scary to me as an African American who's growing up in the South, who's hearing some of the same rhetoric that I heard when George Wallace was running for president. And what's even more afraid to me, I posted on Facebook once, I wrote something about it, and I said to my friends who are on there, if you are concerned that this is a problem, you need to speak now. And most people were silent. I'm concerned is that this kind of rhetoric to me is very, very similar to what gave to the rise of Hitler. And I'm concerned that we're going to end up in a country, if we don't get serious and do something about this and let the grassroots know so they can rise up and go to the polls and vote, then we're going to end up in a situation we wake up the next day and I won't be trying to figure out where I can move outside of the United States, because I know it's going to be very impossible to a person like me and also people in the community in which I serve. So these are the solutions. What would it take to win? You know, I was jotting them down because I think sometimes we have to be, and I've heard a number of people today that have been very, very direct about what needs to go on in order to bring about changes. First of all, I think we need to sound the alarm, because all of this is connected. Climate justice is connected to all of this. If we look at who is funding these people that are making these decisions that are impacting all of us, we will understand why we need to sound the alarm and how all of it is connected. First of all, we need to re-educate people. We need to help them to understand what is really going on. One of the ways in which we can re-educate people is help them to understand who is funding these campaigns. What is the result of all this dirty money? Even in my community, I'm seeing the names of certain people attached to businesses right down the road from where I grew up, in Lowndes County, Alabama. I mean, a lot of the things that are going on there that are impacts of politics in Alabama is related to money that's coming from these national committees that have no regard for how it's impacting people that are on the ground. Also, I feel that we need to get the churches involved. The churches and the faith community need to go out and get these people that have been disenfranchised because of mass incarceration and work on getting people to the polls. We can't wait till next year. Right now, what we need to do is get out there these people that in states where they can be pardoned and their voting rights can be restored. We need to start working on that now. A lot of times what we do is wait until the last minute, right before the election, then try to galvanize and mobilize people. But there's some people, even if we mobilize, they go to the polls, their votes will not count because they're being disenfranchised. That's a problem we need to be working on right now in terms of finding solutions. Also, we need to connect the dots. We need to connect the dots so everybody can understand why this is important. I think that Vice President Gore gave a good example of what happened in Atlanta. I think that we have a good example this weekend in Alabama where the dots were connected, and we had people from various interests that came there. Actually, one of the persons that was there was a follower of Sun Myung Moon. When I first met him, he was very, very involved in the GOP power structure in the state of Alabama, but he was with us this weekend. And it's going to take more of that for us to win this battle. And finally, we have to do what's necessary to change this economic paradigm. We are existing, and I'm finding out just from my own personal experience, seeing people that I supported to get into office, gotten into positions because of this economic paradigm, they've been sucked into it. And instead of working for the interests of the people now, they're working in their own interests because that's the economic system that we're a part of. And until we change that, we're going to keep having more of the same. So how is this all connected on the grassroots level? Because we all breathe the same air. We all breathe the same air. We all have to have water to live. And in my community, what's important to the average family is having land. Having land where our families can grow, and I can keep the land that's in my family so I can pass it on to my daughter, and hopefully her children. We all want this. We want access to clean water. We want access to fresh air. We want access to adequate health care. We need all of that, but that won't happen if we don't deal with the issues that are happening with the climate. And in our communities, I'm seeing high rates of cancer, a lot of cardiovascular disease. Almost everybody has asthma. We need to change this. Thank you.
I'm reminded, I'm doing a little segue here. I'm reminded, we'll go back to Lyla after introduced, but I'm reminded of a recent opinion in the New York Times about the ecological anxiety present in the Third Reich, and this sort of structure of ideology where concerns over whether we had enough food, whether we had enough water, whether we had enough clean air for everyone were one of the ways in which people were motivated to consent to genocide. And so I think that that is very much present and it will worsen as climate change continues to unfold before us.
Because what they're going to do is blame it on the immigrants that are coming to this country. I mean, they're already setting that narrative up to say that not seeing people, I mean, Facebook is a good thing sometimes, but sometimes people let down their guard and post stuff that you wouldn't normally see. And what I'm seeing, even from some of my friends, that are saying things like, we need to build a fence to keep people out. And these were people who were immigrants. I mean, one friend yesterday posted, I posted something about how the Freedmen's Bureau was getting ready to release the records of people that were enslaved, and he went back and posted, well, we need to, what about the white slaves? So instead of me responding to him on Facebook, I responded to him directly, and I told him, I said, you know, I took a DNA test recently. And in that DNA test, I not only found that I had West African ancestry and Native American ancestry, but I also have Northern Irish ancestry and British ancestry too. So you should take a DNA test, because if you take a DNA test, you'll find that color is a social construct and race is a social construct. And then we'll all see that we live and breathe the same air. So he responded, he asked me to send him the link so he can take the test.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to introduce Lyla June Johnston. She was born in Taos, New Mexico, and I think that she's a great example of, just to steal a phrase from Winona LaDuke, struggles for land and life by the native peoples of this country and of North America overall. Lyla has done so much amazing work that I'm probably going to leave something off of this list. But she's a co-founder of the Taos Peace and Reconciliation Council. She comes from Diné or Navajo and Cheyenne ancestries. She is a walker of a 1,000-mile prayer walk through the ancestral Navajo homeland that is exposing the exploitation of Diné land and people by uranium, coal, oil, and gas industries. She's also the lead organizer of the Black Hills Unity Concert, which aims to bring people together for prayer and workshops calling for a return of the Black Hills to the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations. And finally, she's the founder, probably not finally, but at least what I'll conclude is that she's the founder of Regeneration Festival, an annual celebration of children that occurs in 13 countries around the world every September. She is wonderful, and I'm hoping that she can talk to us about some of the struggles that she has seen of people fighting for sacred land and fighting to retain their culture in the face of climate change and the paradigm of colonization.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you, Shay. Thank you, everyone here. Thank you, all of you, for giving us your attention. I just want to say that I love you all so much, and I'm happy to meet some new relatives today. And I'm here for you. You might need to repeat that question, Shay, or I could just talk about what I wanted to talk about. Okay. This is the 6-minute remark part, right? Okay. Okay, so in 6 minutes, I just wanted to talk about how in our communities, we say, as above, so below, and that the universe is like a fractal. The larger pattern is a mirror reflection of the pattern within the pattern. And I think that's really true for this panel where we're talking about the grassroots and the broader movement, and even bringing it from the broader movement to the grassroots down to the personal, which is my personal experience, and how it relates to, I think, our experience with climate change. My personal experience is at once incredibly beautiful and incredibly horrific. I've had a lot of beautiful things happen in my life and been a part of a lot of beautiful things. And like most women, I've also experienced a lot of sexual abuse. And if we define sexual abuse the way that heaven defines sexual abuse, and most of us have experienced that. And in my healing process, I really began to see that the shame, instead of going towards the perpetrator or perpetrators, was being pushed back on myself. And I was really grappling with that, and I disliked myself for quite a while. And then a point came when some mentors came to me and they said, "Daughter, a woman cannot always control what happens to her, but she can control how she responds to it." They said, "What happened to you was not your fault. You didn't ask for it. They caught you off guard. You didn't have any tools to stop it. It's as if you were walking down a path and someone jumped out from behind the bushes and hit you over the head with a club until you knocked out and raped you. That's exactly what happened. There was nothing you could have done to stop it." Now, why am I bringing this up? Because I think it relates to us as the children of the earth experiencing climate change. Did any of us ask for this? Did any of us want this? Did any of us have the tools as children to jump out of the consumer culture? I think probably not, or else we would be in the woods somewhere, like living sustainably. And so I guess what I wanted to say is that, for me, climate change involves a heavy conversation that's laden with shame. We feel shameful as children of God that we've messed up on our one job, which was to take care of the earth, you know? And as a woman, that shame was also on me. And so a lot of my work in the world at the grassroots level is releasing us of shame. And I think that's the greatest tool that the darkness has against us, and the greatest tool that Jesus really worked very hard to liberate the people from, and to say, you're forgiven. Now what are you going to do? And so, in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that at this very pivotal moment with climate change, when none of us really knows what the hell to do, we want to do something. I guess what I would just wanted to say is that it doesn't matter. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. And the way that I would encourage us to respond is with prayer and with faith in Creator. And so, yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Lyla. And our final panelist is Reverend Henrik Grappa. Did I pronounce that correctly? Great, thank you. He's an ordained minister in the Lutheran Church of Sweden, and he's also an officer on sustainable development at the Church of Sweden's Central Office. Reverend Grappa has been a member of the enabling team of the European Christian Environmental Network since 2005. He's also engaged with the preparatory group for the Uppsala Interfaith Climate Summit and was a member of the WCC ecumenical team at the two latest COPs or MOPs held in Nairobi and Bali. Reverend Grappa also does a lot of work with Arctic solidarity with other groups of organizations and churches, and I want to let him introduce his work.
Oh, thank you. Just a small correction. I didn't write the thing right too. I have been to most of the negotiations since Nairobi. Just missed one in Poland in 2008. So I have been to this conference, and we have gone there, and we have all been disappointed every time when we went home. It's a part of the liturgy somehow. But still, I think from this broad perspective, the UN Climate Convention is one of the few places we have where we keep together the agenda of development and mitigations. Some people say, skip the UN, the G20, if they just cut the emissions, we have solved the problem. But I think we must keep it, and this is part of climate justice. We must keep the development agenda together with the mitigation agenda. To me, that was what I learned to be part of this. So I still have, we are upcoming to the Paris meeting. I think we will have some kind of agreement. It will be too weak, it will be not ambitious enough, and it will not be legally binding enough. But it will be one way of getting forward. Since Copenhagen, or what we call Brokenhagen, happened, there's happened very much on regional levels that we couldn't foresee, in Copenhagen, and that is much more encouraging for what's going to happen in the future. I also come from a land where we have, from Sweden, where we have a discussion on refugees. What's happening in Syria and all the refugees coming on the Mediterranean, coming through Hungary, has also unleashed some of the racist remnants of racism in Europe also in a country like Sweden. And some say, why we cannot talk about climate, we must talk about refugees now, how to solve this European problem. But I think we must solve the refugee problem, but we will have even more refugees if we don't deal with the climate change problem. And that is so important to keep these agendas together, to keep the climate change. It's not just an environmental issue, it's as much a social and agenda, and it's an agenda for peace, for global peace. So please keep those together. And I think sometimes we have like Mr. Gore presented, we don't see the big orangutan because we are too focused on one issue at a time. And that is a problem. I think that faith communities sometimes have the capacity to keep more than just one questions up. I also come from a land where we have carbon taxes since the 90s. A long history, and those who were most against this were very much bragging about it 20 years later when I come into government. But that had worked in some place, but that is not a complete solution. There's much more things to do, I think. I think still we have a lot to do, and also that we are in this together. This is not about, the national borders doesn't recognize climate change. We are in this together, and we have to solve this together. And I want to just look at some of the Arctic, what's happening in the Arctic. Since we are Church of Sweden, we are a part of the Arctic region, and since 20 years we have a cooperation between the Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and also some of the Russian Orthodox northern dioceses in the Barents region. And one of the themes has been environment. And I think that is also important because this is also the place for the indigenous people of the Nordic, the Sami people who lives there. And I think that the Arctic is playing an important role in the climatic system from a science perspective. It's a regulator of climate, and a melting Arctic is melting down the climatic system, as we also heard about the methane releases that is a part of the thunder. But the Arctic is also a home. It's also a home for indigenous people, a home that they lived in for a very long time, and with an understanding of the equilibrium of a very sensitive environment. And sometimes, I mean, from the central perspective, we sort of ignore this knowledge. But I heard so much of other voices today, so I say I hope that's not true anymore. And the Arctic is not a wide area of untouched land, as we often, from a southern perspective, look at it. It's actually a home for people. Even if there are not so many living in the region, they are there, and it's a home. And also I think that Church of Sweden is present in the Arctic. And for me, and this is important, to be a faith community and to be church is to be contextual. If we do not react on our context, I don't think we can call ourselves church anymore. Then it's, like my former archbishop said, it's most about comfort. And I don't think that is the right way of being church. To be church is to be called to act for justice. And when it comes to the Arctic, the context is telling us that due to emissions of greenhouse gases, the ecosystems of the Arctic is endangered. It's also a threat to indigenous people living in the region and a threat to their houses, like in Alaska, where the melting permafrost damage houses and erode coastlines in a very rapid way. It's also a threat to reindeer herds when the weather patterns changes and affects the pasture of the reindeers. We've seen it already many times. And not to forget, the melting ice brings new interest to the region. Looking to exploit nature resources, fossil fuels is one of them, but also minerals. And that is also has sort of happened under the radar, because suddenly it's easier to exploit minerals, and that starts to boom. That often ruins the environment, leads to also to social problems, and suddenly they are gone after just a few years with the mining. Given this context, what does it mean to be church and a faith community in this context? I think we have to share the stories among us. In communities of churches, we have to share the stories. And this is something that I learned from far ago when I was in the 2002 Johannesburg summit. And John Pronk, who was sort of the envoy for the UN on this conference, he said, US churches, you can never compete with the environmentalists. They have all the expertise. But US churches, you can bear the witnesses, you can take the voices out. And that is something that not so many organizations do, because you are in that case, you are grassroots. And to tell the stories, what is happening in the Arctic, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in North America, Asia, everywhere, we have stories that we need to tell. And from faith communities, I think it's important to let those stories come up. And I think we need to take steps to understand also the interconnectedness that we have talked so much about today. The threats of climate change is generated by developed countries. As a community of churches, we need the insight to achieve a turning process that will lead to a transformation. And I heard the word transformation many times today. A transformation to a sustainable world. And that is not just to change light bulbs. This is a transformation of the heart, I would say. I think also the spirituality of indigenous people is not something exotic. I think it's an important contribution to our understanding of how interconnected we are. We need to get that knowledge in once again. Not as an exotic thing that sounds nice to us, but it's something that is really important for the understanding. As we have a lot to do. We have a history of oppression as a long history of being church in this country. Regarding indigenous people, we have to work more on the reconciliation. We still need a much deeper insight in that the climate challenge is more than a switch, like I said, of energy. We are in deep need for a transformation to low carbon and to a society that understands to live inside the planetary boundaries. We also heard about planetary boundaries, and I like that because it's an inclusive way of talking about the threats we are facing. And to come to that change, I think that faith communities could play a more pivotal role. I think everybody has said everything I say now today, so I'm more or less trying to sum that. As much as I think that indigenous spirituality could contribute to that. Even if we in Church of Sweden has been active on this for many years, I think we still have lots more to do. I would sum up with two pictures. One is that I stole from my archbishop, the former archbishop, and I was quoted by Lyla Rasmussen, I heard on this, and he said, there was a Danish pastor who said, okay, I'm Swedish, but it's fine. must keep them together to get something. Is there despair or is there hope? I think every night is both. I awake. But I like a quote from St. Augustine, who I think was one of the interesting theologians, who at his time of a great transformation combined many of the best way of thinking philosophies and theologies and to do a theology that was sort of fruitful for the coming generations. He said about hope, he said, hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. That's not a passive hope, that's an active hope, and I think we need it.
So I have one question for the panelists, but before that I want to, and then we'll open up to the audience, but before that I wondered if they have any questions for each other.
Yeah, I have a question for Lyla. I was very moved by the way that you talked about shame, and I think that could be actually really critical to our movement, because I feel like sometimes a lot of the resistance that we get is from people who see our movement as trying to impose shame on people, of shame for not, remembering their water bottle, or like shame for driving too much, and all, for falling short of being like the perfect environmentalist. And so a lot of those people like really hold back. And so I think, if we could make this a movement that liberates people from shame, it could really trouble that. And my question is I guess about how to have that conversation. Because I think for me and probably for a lot of our culture, shame is seen as like a private thing that's got to be like, there's got to be like a relationship of trust there to even have this conversation. But there are people who don't want to have anything to do with our movement because they're afraid that we're going to shame them. And so how do we invite them into that conversation about liberating each other from shame?
Sure. So I think my answer is so radically outside of the paradigm that we are allowed to live in that it might be kind of hard to swallow maybe, but so in my Dene culture, we're taught about Ma'i very young, and Ma'i is the coyote spirit. And a lot of people have misinterpreted our lore and our legends to think that Ma'i is a happy-go-lucky trickster who's just having fun, but that's not true. Ma'i is actually a very twisted and cruel soul that was originally appointed as a guardian of the earth. And it was endowed with all the information that it needed to take care of the earth. And just as it was given all the information it needed to steward the earth, it could conversely use this information to dominate and enslave the earth. And at a certain point, it lost a friend because this friend was advancing on the spiritual plane. And she was becoming so big, as in close to the Creator, that he was feeling a sense of separation from her. And this freaked him out so bad that he started falling. He started falling and he became jealous, he became scared, and he fell. And at this point in time, he started to leverage all of this knowledge to dominate and enslave the earth. And I'm sure this story may sound a little familiar to some of you because this story is not a story, it's a reality. There's a being that has no power whatsoever. That's the difference between Lucifer and Ma'i. We called it coyote because coyotes are kind of scrawny and weak and they lurk in the shadows. And that's our understanding of Lucifer, is that it's not this big, mighty, powerful being. It's actually an incredibly weak being that has no power over us. It is very clever though, and it knows how to trick us into giving it our power. So basically, to answer your question, I do not see human beings as these these misfits of creation that just screwed up so badly that they destroyed the planet. I see human beings as being hijacked by the coyote spirit to destroy this earth, to get back at the whole system that Creator has planned for us. And so that's the way I would approach it, is I would say, Koch brothers, you aren't bad. What happened was, in your childhood, you experienced some serious trauma, which led you to fear, which led you to anger, which led you to jealousy or whatever it was, and that you are allowing your vessel to be controlled by the Ma'i. And if you would just let go of your fear for a moment, if you would just trust that the Creator and creation has everything you need to be happy and joyful, you could work for Creator once again. You could be a warrior for Creator. And they would be like, oh, a warrior for Creator, I could do that. And so that's kind of how I operate, is that I talk to them, and instead of shaming them and blaming them, just try and bring them into the larger spiritual picture. What we see here, as Mr. Gore said, is not all that there is. There's a world behind the world, and that's the world that a lot of religions are touching on, and we need to bring that knowledge, that esoteric knowledge, back out. So again, I know that's pretty radically different than maybe you were expecting, but I wanted to be honest in what I thought.
So my question is this, and it's riffing a little bit off of Tim's remarks, which is that I think that at the Grassroots, we are so much in touch with the truly terrible reality that we're faced with, perhaps more than is possible if you're sort of engaging with it abstractly, or involved with, I guess, even more policy-minded organizations. And that's not a criticism, mind you, but I think it's just true that if you're dealing with this reality day in and day out, you have a sort of experience, a very visceral experience with despair, just by virtue of being in that situation. And I want to ask, because I think that one of the reasons we don't tell the truth so much is because, like you said, we don't think people can handle the truth, because we think that people will be overcome by despair. So I want to ask, especially on this side of the room, how we deal with the despair that comes from this kind of grassroots encounter with the magnitude of the problem we face, and what lessons we can draw on that as the broader climate movement.
Well, from my perspective, I'm an optimist, and I get on my knees and pray every night. And I believe, and I draw faith from the history of my people who were brought here as slaves, but still, through it all, we were able, even the Christianity that was used to enslave us, we use that same Christianity to free us. So when I look at the civil rights movement, when I look at Dr. King and the people that were in that movement and what they were facing, but they got on their knees and prayed anyway, even when they had to pray with their eyes open. So I do believe that the reason that I'm here, the reason that I continue to fight, because I think we're going to win. You know, I really think we're going to win. I don't have a lot of despair. If I was overcome by despair, I wouldn't do what I do. But I feel that slowly but surely, we're going to win. And I do believe that there's a deity that's greater than us, and greater than all the people that are out here destroying everything. And I still believe in miracles. But I feel that we have to slowly, and in some cases very fast, but as long as we work on educating the people in the community, I think that they can accept the truth, but I think we can change it too. I think we can turn it into another reality.
Yeah, this is something that I struggled with a couple of times. Also how to address this. You can address this. We see all the things is going to happen. It's going down the way. Or you can see, well, maybe we have some possibilities to make this step to a much better world. And often I think we have too much of just like to shut it off and don't want to listen, and then we have to face it and then we feel despair. But when we sort of start struggling with it, that also fuels some kind of hope. So for me, it's important to be realistic. Don't. I mean, as you also sort of you saw those mail that say we have reached this and that, and everyone knows it's not the truth. But it's a false way of getting people sort of involved. But we have to keep to the truth, but we also have to keep to the good stories, what actually could be achieved. And there are many good stories to but also from a theological level, I think this is one, at least my tradition, we often talk about, well, I often think about Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, who talked about hope. He said that hope is beyond prognosis. Hope and prognosis is not the same. The prognosis said this is possible to happen, but hope is beyond prognosis. And he also said that hope has its roots in the transcendence. And that's interesting to hear from a politician, to say that is in transcendence. And for me, this resonates in St. Paul, who talks about Abraham, who says, when all hope was run out, Abraham stayed to his hope. And that is a paradox in some way. But to me, it's also a kind of relief to say, hope is something to create something different. And to go back to Václav Havel, he said, when they formulated the Chart of 77, under the worst oppression during the communist time, they said, we didn't really thought it would happen, but we did it anyway. And he said, I was one of the most surprised when it actually shifted. And even though he sort of wrote the hope, and I think that is also like, I was asking myself, is it really worth going over and emitting greenhouse gases of tons to come for one day to take part of this? Yes, I think it's still important, because this is a way of gathering hope, and also to realize we are in a structure that we want to rearrange, that we want to change. And I think that is important to have the message of face the realities, but also that there is hope.
Thank you.
And I'd love to address that as well, because it's something that I've thought a lot about, and I've struggled with a lot. Unlike Catherine, I do have a lot of despair, and I've had a long relationship with despair. And I can remember when that relationship started, and it felt like a huge burden, and that like carrying around this despair might crush me or might slow me down. And then I began to shift my relationship with despair to seeing it rather than a burden, as to seeing it as an anchor. That despair still felt like a great weight, but I realized that like any great weight that you carry around, it's only a burden in calm and tranquil times, but that in stormy times, in high winds, having a big rock to hold on to is what can keep you grounded and what keeps you safe. And so I began to feel that despair that I carried around with me all the time as the anchor that held me fast in my place, that made me not easily get blown away and get pushed around. And so as I do my work, particularly in the scariest moments of standing up against entrenched power, of facing risks and threats and real sacrifice, I remember that I have that heaviness of that despair to anchor me in place, and that I'm not going to back up and I'm not going to retreat, because that despair is an asset in such stormy times.
Wow. Should I answer that too?
If you want to.
Okay. I'm a native person, obviously, but I was actually told to not read the Bible because of what it did to my people and the conversions and and things like that, and that it was anti-Native American to read the Bible. But then when I got in my 20s, I started cracking it open when no one was looking. And I actually thought it was very Native American in many ways. So I actually have a verse that I think addresses this that I texted to myself for this moment. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being overtaken by the waves. But he was asleep. And the disciples went to him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O ye of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him?" And so I think that the climate scientists continually fail to take into account the power of our sacred sites, the power of our sacred rituals, and the power of the Creator, and that He's the Creator, or she, depending on where you come from. She's the Creator. She can do anything she wants. And it's not like she's just letting us dangle and be swept away, but that, you know, in Chinese medicine, an illness, a bodily illness such as cancer or pneumonia, it's not a bad thing. It's simply a messenger telling you that your life is out of balance. And so to me, the climate change itself is like this illness that's manifesting in the physical form. And to me, it's not as crazy as it sounds, it's not a bad thing. It's simply a messenger telling us that our life is out of balance. And it's bringing us back into balance. It's bringing us into this room. It's bringing us into this despair, this compassion for our brothers and sisters. And this is really, I guess, something that it's not that I'm not afraid of it. I am afraid of it. But it's in these times of despair when I need hope, I really remember that a Creator can help us. I was in an earthquake in 2010, an 8.8 in Chile. I jumped off the third-story balcony because I thought the building was going to crumble. I broke my pelvis and my spine, and I didn't die. And to me, that experience really showed me Creator is in control, because by all laws of physics, I should have died, but I didn't. And so I know that these times are hard, and I know that many people are dying and suffering. And I also know that if we can release fear and replace it with faith, we can move through this together. Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience, perhaps, if there are any. Did we cover it pretty well? Yes, come on up to the mic.
Lots of people have said, I'm Mordechai Liebling, a rabbi. Lots of people have said that this is a time for not business as usual, and we need to challenge the prevailing paradigm very strongly. So I want to lift up 2 things that are happening now and ask a question. So right now in Washington, D.C., some Franciscans are doing a 10-day water fast in preparation for the Pope's visit, and the folks from Beyond Extreme Energy are doing an 18-day water fast, sleeping out in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission because they're protesting the permits that FERC is giving for fracking. So that's an extreme act, an 18-day water fast. That is clearly making a statement of not business as usual, and it's taking public ritual to another level. So I want to ask you, what acts do you think are useful that are not business as usual, and what is the role of public ritual?
I'll start with that because I was down in D.C. yesterday and I went to visit the people that are fasting in front of FERC, and they were on day 8 of their fast when I was down there yesterday, and it was taking its toll. You know, you could there were several of them that you could look at and tell that they were fasting at this point, and so it is something that I think not only gets attention, but also shows the vulnerability of the situation. And so to me, that's a key part of things that disrupt the status quo is using the power of our vulnerability to invite people into a different kind of dialogue. And to me, that's part of the power of civil disobedience. When it is used to its full potential, is tapping into that power of vulnerability. And that was certainly my experience in Utah. You know, when I was facing 10 years in prison for my act of civil disobedience, you know, Utah is a very conservative place and has more than its share of climate denial. And I noticed that it opened up a different kind of dialogue with people who normally have this intellectual barrier that are like, oh, climate change, that's a liberal issue, I don't want to hear anything about that, na 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 na. When they saw that someone had voluntarily put themselves in that vulnerable of a position, they kind of connected on this deeper level that wasn't intellectual, but it was sort of this, what I understood to be kind of an innate human nature to try to understand another person's vulnerability. And so I had a lot of those otherwise extremely conservative people come to me and say, basically, like, why would you put yourself in this position? And it wasn't like a gotcha kind of interaction. It was actually a genuine desire to understand. And so I found that I was able to talk about my motivations that stemmed from the climate crisis in a way that got past all those intellectual barriers. And I think vulnerability is something that that is normally not prized in our society. You know, normally we view strength and security to be almost synonymous. You know, and certainly in our modern state of homeland security and the super emphasis on security in our politics, the notion of vulnerability is like a terrible thing. You know, who would want vulnerability? What kind of nation would want vulnerability? What kind of person would want vulnerability? And so when we as activists embrace vulnerability and step into vulnerability and find a power in that vulnerability, I think that's actually a path is most genuine. But to really explore the power and the opportunity that is opened up when vulnerability disrupts that status quo.
I know that we said that there would be 2 questions. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a change of program.
We're going to have just a quick interlude here. You know, you made the point that you're not able to really be in collaboration with somebody until you're able to tell them the truth in full measure. We've had a wonderful occasion today where we've had a workshop around, help me out, Troy, I don't want to, song leading. And one of the participants has so generously offered to be with us at the close of today's session to lead us in a closing song. She needs to make her way down to Midtown by 6 o'clock. So we want to deftly, for just one moment, interrupt, because we do want to, this is such an incredible line of response to the question, and we do have another follow-up question, but we would so very much like for you to be able to come forward and share with us even in these few moments. Doesn't that make sense?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, friends, and thank you for all this wonderful work you're doing today. I work for an organization called Music That Makes Community. We teach workshops to teach clergy and musicians a style of paperless song leadership that allows people to lead one another in singing without the use of written music. So I offer this song to you so that you can take it with you and draw on it when you need it. I'm going to stand over here because I don't need the microphone, okay?
Yep.
What we need is here.
What we need is here.
What
Well, I'll only speak if John Grimm gets a couple of minutes, because he sat down for me, and I know we want to hear from him too. So can I bargain for, I'll cede 2 of my minutes? John, get up there. Anyway, I want to say one thing. What we know from neuropsychology is that singing and music does change how our brain is operating. And so that was a wonderful thing to introduce us to. When you feel despair, remember there are different ways to learn and to think and know. But what I got up to say is I'm a Quaker, and so the common question for a Quaker, especially the silent kind, is why do you all get together to be silent when you can be silent by yourself? And that is because it really does make a difference. And there is a corporal sense when you're together that isn't there when you're by yourself. So this is how I deal with despair. A year ago, despite all the efforts to pit group after group, that's been the main tactic, labor against environment, black against white, all of these ways, I marched with 400,000 people of every faith, every color, every background. The unions were there, and the teachers were there, and the high school kids from Newark were there, and we were just one all around the globe. So when I feel despair, I go back to that moment where the divide and conquer didn't work. And I just remember, I came around the corner with the interfaith group, and we saw everybody still pouring out, and I broke into tears because through a very decentralized and huge, huge, huge process, all those people were there. So when you feel despair, remember there is a spirit that was unleashed. We have people talking about it today. There was a spirit there that it wasn't unleashed, but it was claimed. And the indigenous folks were our leaders. So that's where I go in those moments of despair. And I thank all of you that marched and led.
Laurel, thanks for calling me out. I hope you all don't regret that you gave the microphone to me now. It may be so, because I wanted to follow despair also. I wanted to see everybody. But before going into that deep pit, I just wanted to give an award to Shay. I think he has the most spectacular water bottle that I've ever seen a moderator have. So on that note, Tim, I'm thinking of that the rock that anchors in the midst of, and the responses that your panelists gave to that. Teilhard de Chardin, his name has come up today, and I wanted to remember another New Yorker, Hans Jonas, a philosopher who came from Germany in the 30s, and he escaped the Holocaust, but most of his family did not. That informed his work. He also carried a kind of a rock in his life, so that he would actually criticize Teilhard for being too optimistic. I wouldn't agree with that criticism, but I feel Jonas understood something that this panel has been talking about also. And Jonas, at the end of his first of the three major works in his life, the end of the first one, in his phenomenology of life, he gives his myth. And it's really fun to hear a philosopher who's so committed to rational thought say, I'm going to give you my myth. And he proceeds to tell of the feeling he has about evolution and God. And he talks about God in evolution, very similar to Teilhard in that sense. But what he does also is he visits each and every one of those who died in the Holocaust. And he raises the question of our human capacity to give possibilities to God in evolution. It's a powerful vision that he had, but I was so struck when I heard your comment about that rock. I felt I wanted to honor him because he also wanted to revisit the environmental world at a time when not many in his community, his tribe, were interested in those issues. And when he was carrying constantly that sense of those in his family, those who had been taken, those who had never had the possibility to give to God through their lives. And so I feel his presence and wanted to honor him in your burden.
Thank you.
I think that's a great closing.
2 or 3 sentences just to say one author.
I'm afraid we really don't have time. I wish we did, but we are running 15 minutes over already, and I want to turn it over to Derek Harkins, Vice President of Union Theological Seminary, to close us out. I believe he's going to pass it on to somebody else. Is that right?